Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Hosea.
Oh my goodness. Poor Hosea. I mean, not poor on the one hand. The guy got to interact with the God who made all things, and he's held out as having this massive prophetic career, which is a great honor. But much like the other prophets who we get some biographical data about here in the prophetic section of the Old Testament, being a prophet was a really rough draw in terms of personal comfort and basic human happiness. You're pitted against all of your fellow countrymen. Your job is to be commissioned by God to say this whole thing is going off of a cliff. Nobody likes hearing that. And there's going to be a whole lot of suffering. We see how much Jeremiah suffered. We see how costly the execution of his prophetic duties was for Ezekiel. But maybe nobody gets a rawer deal than Hosea in the worldly sense, at least, because God commissions him to do something very, very personal and very difficult with his life as sort of, again, that performance art style prophecy. We saw that in Ezekiel, you'll recall as well, where God had Ezekiel go and do really strange things in public, like lie on the ground and bind yourself up and you got to eat food roasted over poop and things like that. Well, Ezekiel is not the only prophet who God commissions to do this visual aid performance art style prophecy to make his point. The book of Hosea opens by giving us a time frame for when everything is going on. This is more or less all the background information we get on the guy at all. Looks like he was working in roughly the middle of the 700s BC up till roughly the end of the 700s BC. And in that time, which is dominated by the long shadow of the wicked, horrible king Jeroboam II, Hosea is speaking to the northern kingdom while they are in a phase where they're really into Canaanite culture and style and fashion and worship and abominations, but they're also really into trying to buddy up to the big superpowers of the day where everything is so cosmopolitan and cool, not backwards like it is here. Hosea is writing to people who just love Assyria. I mean, they're a little afraid of Assyria too, but Assyria, like, that's where awesome stuff happens. And sure, we could never be Assyria, but we could like be their wingman and they could protect us from other threats. Now, as we read through Hosea, we figure out like they still do sacrifices and stuff or whatever, like on their way to worship the Canaanite gods or on their way to engage in horrible practices that are popular amongst the much more fashionable Assyrians to the north. So like, there's still like, go to church and stuff, but it's a fraud. And so how popular is Hosea going to be for coming along and being like, hey, it's a fraud and your weird, gross romance with Assyria and even Egypt is going to backfire on you and Assyria is ultimately going to destroy you and take you away into captivity. That's a pretty rough draw for Hosea. And then after we get past the historical context and setting and all of that business, then we get into the part where it gets personal. And God specifically says to Hosea, go take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord. Obviously, I'm sure that's disappointing for him. You never want to have God show up and tell you to marry a prostitute, if you can help it at least. But despite any understandable misgivings he might have, Hosea goes and does what God told him to do. He marries this woman named Gomer, and there's a reason that's not a Bible name that you see a lot of little girls running around with these days, because even though it's not clear whether or not she was into prostitution at the time they got married, it's very clear from the text that she was very into the prostitution thing after they got married. Well, Gomer and Hosea, air quotes here, have 3 kids together. Maybe they're all Hosea's. I think you can make a case from the raw material of the text that one or more might be from these other relationships, but Hosea treats them like his kids. And in keeping with this performance art prophecy approach that God is commanding him to take, he gives the kids really rough names that point backwards toward the atrocities of the current dynasty of kings in the northern kingdom of Israel, that also look forward in anticipation of God's judgment and justice for that'll come in 722 when the Assyrians come in and conquer the northern kingdom. And then the names also point to God's disappointment with his people. Disappointment, that's a grand understatement, but I think you get what I mean. And God's impulse to even consider putting them away, divorcing his own people. So then on top of these kids being born and having these names, Gomer then adds insult to injury by going and, as some people view it, selling herself voluntarily into some kind of prostitutional slavery to somebody else. Other people read it as she just left Hosea for so long and was with someone else that she was no longer regarded culturally as his wife. Either way, if he wants her back, he's going to have to take his own name, his own resources, his own reputation, and go do something about this. I know this situation sounds insane and ridiculous and even cruel to put somebody through it. Make of that what you will, but it sets up the big grand question of Hosea, and indeed the big grand question kind of the whole Old Testament relationship between God and his chosen people. And the question goes like this: should Hosea and should God just let their bride, who voluntarily sold themselves into the darkest, most debasing, shameful type of slavery, should they just let them go? Or should God and Hosea, with their own resources, their own reputation, go and buy back their bride from their own self-inflicted, debased slavery? And as we work through the book, we discovered that there's this gross imbalance in the relationship that Israel has with these foreign superpowers and that Gomer has with these other men. They chase after them and admire them and love them and throw themselves at these other outside things. But these outside things, Assyria, these other men, they don't seem to love Gomer. They don't seem to love Israel back. Certainly Assyria doesn't. For all of the admiration of Assyria and kowtowing to Assyria, it's not too long and they're going to come down and wipe out Israel altogether. But in contrast, we see God, who is right to be irritated, Hosea, who is right to be irritated, even right to ponder washing their hands of the whole thing. They don't do it because they're actually committed to this love. So in chapter 2, we get a poem that spells all of this stuff out, that recounts some of the ugliness of Israel along the way. And then we start to get some answers at the beginning of chapter 3 that points to how God is going to respond to this metaphorical adulterous situation that's going on with his people who he loves. And we get that through this performance art prophecy in the life of Hosea. Here's what happens. Hosea 3:1. The Lord said to me, "Go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes." And then in one of the most plainly understated statements of beauty and profundity in the entire Bible, Hosea just casually says, "So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and lethek of barley." Dude went and used his meager resources to buy his wife back out of trafficking and slavery that she voluntarily signed up for. And he didn't have enough to get it done with just coins. He had the equivalent of about 5 silver coins, which, just as a point of reference, sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's it. That's what he was able to muster to buy her back, and he had to pay the rest with barley. Well, the rest of Hosea plays out this whole situation over the course of several different movements and poems. And the simple version of all of that is this: God is very unhappy with the behavior of his people. There is judgment coming for his people. But the question of will he divorce them is answered the same way the question of will Hosea divorce Gomer is answered. No, he's not going to. And we get these beautiful passages, particularly in chapter 11, where you get these overtones of the prodigal son as God talks about his love for Jacob, for Ephraim, and how he was there when Ephraim took his first steps, and he's a dad toward this kid, and he can't help but have his heart soft. And then also we've obviously got the metaphor throughout the book that's more of the husband and wife, but these are two of the most intimate relationships that anybody can imagine, where you just can't help but love the other person. And God draws on both of these. And in this beautiful anticipation of the prodigal son message in Luke 15 that we get from Jesus, God spells out the reality that he's not just using the people of Israel for performance art himself. They aren't just pawns that he doesn't actually care about, but he's just acting out his power and redemptive plan on. He actually loves them. And I don't understand enough about the nature of an infinite being to know if you can hurt him in the way that you can hurt another person. But at the very least, he's taking on human categories of emotion and relationships to communicate that in a way that humans can understand, and that this is hurtful. I love you, and this is hurtful. And those other people you're running after, those other things you're running after, they don't love you. They will not forgive you. They will not be patient with you. They will not chasten you. They're using you. And then in chapter 14, in the midst of more difficult language, we look forward to something that is echoed in Matthew 13 and Jesus' parable about the little mustard seed and the great tree that grows up and all the birds and creatures take shelter in it. There's that same kind of language there about the plans that God still has for his chosen people and what is going to be built up out of this mess of a relationship that they have made. And in the conclusion of the book in chapter 14, we get the payoff with what was hinted in all the imagery throughout, that God is going to judge, but he's also going to restore. He's still in on the redemptive plan. He still loves his people. And chapter 14 is pretty cool because there are several details that indicate that, hey, like this isn't just about Israel and one political moment with the northern kingdom locked in time back in the 8th century. There's something very transcendent here. And the final verse of the whole thing is, who is wise? He will realize these things. Who is discerning? He'll understand them. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. In other words, what's being said is, no matter where you are and no matter what time, the things of God, the reality of his character and the redemptive work that he's doing, these things are unchanging and the same. But some in any given age are going to encounter those things, and it'll be a foundation. It'll be life-giving. It'll be a source of strength and orientation. Others will crash against it. And we see Jesus employing this language in the New Testament as well. I don't want to take your brain to too dark of a place, but when you visualize Hosea, picture this poor, impoverished man with the last coins he has to his name, walking into a brothel and buying his own wife back from the degenerate who has taken ownership of her. When you're considering the theme of Hosea, reflect on God's faithfulness even when his people who he loves are not faithful. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, get chapter 1, get the first few verses of chapter 3, maybe in the middle of that, catch chapter 2, verses 19 through 20, and make sure you catch the remarks about Ephraim and God's tender heart toward his people in chapter 11, verses 1 through 12. All right, my friends, achievement unlocked. That's Hosea for both of us. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.